The bones were 40,000 years old, but the questions they raised would shake the galaxy. Doctor Riva-san pressed her silver fingers against the glass container. Inside, preserved in stasis fluid, lay the skull of a creature that should have ruled Earth. It was thick, heavy, built for survival. Yet the species it belonged to had vanished long before humans ever looked up at the stars. "This makes no sense," said Dr. Holmgren from across the laboratory. The four-armed Kassorian geneticist was staring at his display screens with obvious confusion. "I have run the analysis 7 times. The results are the same." Riva turned away from the skull. "Show me." Hallam pulled up the data with 2 of his hands while the other 2 scratched his rough, gray chin. "The Galactic Consortium wants a full evolutionary report on humanity before we grant them union membership. Standard procedure." So I compared their genome to their closest extinct relative, the Neanderthals. "Yes." Hallam pointed at the comparison chart. "Look at this. Neanderthals had 30% more muscle mass than humans. Their bones were denser. Their skulls were thicker. They had larger lung capacity and better adaptation to cold climates. Their brains were the same size as human brains, sometimes larger." Riva studied the data. They were physically superior in every measurable way. "Exactly." Hallam threw all 4 arms up in frustration. "So why are they extinct? Why did the weaker species survive?" This was the question that would consume them for the next several days. And the answer would change how they viewed humanity forever. Riva requested full access to Earth's archaeological archives. The consortium had collected millions of genetic samples during their preliminary surveys of the planet. DNA from ancient burial sites, preserved tissue from frozen remains, hair and bone fragments from caves that had not seen light in tens of thousands of years. She spent hours reviewing the timeline of both species. Humans and Neanderthals had coexisted for nearly 5,000 years. They lived in the same regions, hunted the same animals, used similar tools, yet only one survived. "Perhaps the humans killed them," Hallam suggested. "Val, genocide. It would explain the extinction." Riva shook her head. "There is no evidence of large-scale conflict. No mass graves. No signs of violence beyond occasional individual disputes." She pulled up another file. "In fact, I found something strange. Neanderthal DNA exists in modern humans." Hallam leaned forward. "What?" "Between 1 and 4% of the genome in most human populations contains Neanderthal genetic markers." Riva highlighted the relevant data. They did not just coexist. They interbred. The humans accepted Neanderthals into their groups. Then how did the Neanderthals disappear? Riva did not have an answer yet, but she was beginning to form a theory. She examined the social structures of both species. Neanderthal groups were small, 10 to 15 individuals at most, tight family units that rarely interacted with other groups. They were self-sufficient, independent. They did not need others. Humans are different. Human groups were larger, sometimes 50 or 100 individuals living together. And they did not stay isolated. Archaeological evidence showed trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, shells from coastal regions found in mountain caves, tools made from stone that only existed in distant lands, ideas and technologies spreading across entire continents. "They talk to each other," Riva said quietly, "not just within their groups, between groups, across vast distances." Hallam frowned. "Communication between groups is common. Many species do this. Not like humans." Riva pulled up brain chemistry comparisons. "Look at their neurological structure. Elevated oxytocin responses to unfamiliar faces. Dopamine rewards for successful social bonding. Reduced aggression toward individuals outside their immediate group." She turned to face Hallam directly. "Neanderthals saw strangers as threats. Humans saw strangers as opportunities." Hallam was silent for a long moment. "You're suggesting they won through friendliness?" "I am suggesting they survived because they could form connections that Neanderthals could not." Riva looked back at the skull in its container. The Neanderthals were stronger, tougher, better adapted to harsh conditions. But they could not do the one thing that mattered most, which was Riva met his eyes. They could not turn an enemy into a friend. Hallam considered this. Then he pulled up the genetic data again, focusing on a specific cluster of genes. There is something else. A set of genes related to language complexity and social cognition. The humans have it. The Neanderthals did not. What does it do? It allows for complex communication with strangers. The ability to quickly establish trust. To share ideas with individuals you have never met before. Hallam sat back in his chair. They were built for connection. It was written into their DNA. Riva nodded slowly. The Neanderthals lived in families. The humans lived in networks. And when times grew hard, the network survived. She saved her preliminary notes and began preparing for a deeper investigation. This was only the beginning. She needed to understand exactly how humans had used this ability. And more importantly, she needed to understand what it meant for the rest of the galaxy. Because if humans had absorbed the Neanderthals through friendship and connection, what would they do when they met other species among the stars? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Hallam looked at the genetic data one more time. They're inside the survivors, he said quietly. The Neanderthals did not just disappear. They became part of humanity. Riva did not respond. She was already thinking about what that meant for species like her own. 17 reconstructed bodies stood in the laboratory like silent soldiers waiting for inspection. Riva walked between them slowly. 9 were Neanderthals. 8 were early humans. Each one had been rebuilt from genetic data using consortium technology. Skin, muscle, bone, and organ. Perfect replicas of beings who had died 40,000 years before humans ever dreamed of spaceflight. Hallam stood at the control panel, adjusting the lighting so every detail was visible. I still cannot accept it, he said. Look at them, Riva. Really look. She did not need to look. She had memorized the specifications. But she looked anyway. The Neanderthal reconstructions were impressive. Shorter than humans, but far more powerful. Their shoulders were broad and thick with muscle. Their chests were barrel-shaped, designed to hold massive lungs. Their arms were built for crushing force. Their skulls were heavy and strong, with prominent brow ridges that protected their eyes. The humans standing beside them looked fragile by comparison. Thinner, lighter. Their bones were more delicate. Their muscles were smaller. In a direct physical confrontation, there was no question who would win. Run the strength tests again, Riva said. Hallam activated the simulation. Numbers appeared above each reconstruction. Grip strength, bite force, running speed, endurance, cold tolerance. The Neanderthals won nearly every category. A single Neanderthal could have killed 2 or 3 humans in combat, Hallam said. Maybe more. Their bodies were weapons. They were evolved for violence and survival in the harshest conditions Earth could produce. Riva nodded. And yet they lost. How? Hallam's voice carried genuine frustration. I have studied hundreds of evolutionary competitions across dozens of worlds. The physically superior species almost always wins. That is how natural selection works. The strong survive. The weak perish. Unless the weak find another way to be strong. Hallam turned to face her. Explain. Riva walked to the control panel and changed the display. Instead of physical data, she pulled up archaeological records. Maps of ancient Earth showing the distribution of both species over time. Neanderthal groups were small, she said. Typically 10 to 15 individuals. Family units. They rarely interacted with groups outside their immediate territory. When they did encounter strangers, they were cautious. Sometimes hostile. The map showed small dots scattered across Europe and Western Asia. Each dot represented a Neanderthal group. They were isolated, separated, alone. Now, look at humans. She changed the display. The human dots were closer together. Lines connected them, representing trade routes and migration paths. The network covered entire continents. Human groups were larger, Riva continued, and they connected with other groups constantly. They shared food during famines. They exchanged tools and technologies. They warned each other about dangers. They formed alliances that could mobilize hundreds of individuals. Hallam studied the map. But what good is a network against physical strength? Everything. Riva pointed to a specific region on the map. This is Europe 40,000 years ago. A harsh winter strikes. Food becomes scarce. What does a Neanderthal group do? They hunt. They survive on their own. They are built for exactly this situation. Correct. But what if the hunting fails? What if the animals have migrated? What if disease strikes the group? Riva highlighted the isolated Neanderthal dots. They have no one to call for help. No allies. No network. They either survive alone or they die alone. She shifted focus to the human dots. Now look at the humans. The same winter strikes. The same food shortage. But they send runners to allied groups 50 kilometers away. Those groups share their cash supplies. Or they send hunters to help. Or they take in the starving families until conditions improve. Hallam was silent. The humans were weaker individually, Riva said. But they were never truly alone. Every stranger they met was a potential ally. Every connection was a safety net. They built their strength through numbers and cooperation rather than muscle and bone. Hallam walked to one of the Neanderthal reconstructions and placed a hand on its shoulder. The muscle beneath the synthetic skin was dense and hard. They were magnificent, he said quietly. Perfect survival machines. Perfect for one kind of survival. Riva stood beside him. But evolution does not reward perfection. It rewards adaptation. And humans adapted to something Neanderthals never could. What? Other people. Riva looked at the human reconstructions. Their brains evolved to process social information at incredible speeds, to read facial expressions, to detect lies, to build trust quickly, to communicate complex ideas with strangers. Their greatest adaptation was not physical. It was social. Hallam turned back to the data displays. He pulled up brain scans of both species, side by side. The structures were similar in many ways. But certain regions in a human brain were larger, more developed, areas associated with language, empathy, and social cognition. They were built for connection, Hallam said. Their bodies were weak, so their brains evolved to find strength in others. Riva nodded. The Neanderthals could survive anything except isolation. And that is exactly what they faced. Not because humans forced them out, but because humans formed networks that Neanderthals could not compete with. She saved the data and prepared for the next phase of their investigation. They needed to see it happen. They needed to watch the process unfold. I am requesting access to the simulation chambers, Riva said. We need to observe both species in action. See how they lived, how they interacted. Hallam agreed. The numbers told part of the story. But some things could only be understood by watching them with your own eyes. The answer to why humans survived was becoming clearer. But Riva suspected the full truth would be far more unsettling than either of them expected. Snow fell through Riva's holographic body as she stood in prehistoric Europe. The simulation was perfect. Cold wind, gray sky, a frozen landscape that stretched to distant mountains. 45,000 years in the past, recreated in exact detail by consortium technology. She could see her breath in the air, even though she knew none of this was real. Beside her, Hallam watched with all four arms crossed. This technology never stops amazing me, he said. We are standing in a world that no longer exists. Focus, Riva said. There. She pointed toward a group of figures moving through the snow. 7 Neanderthals, carrying spears and stone tools. They moved in perfect silence. No motion, no unnecessary sound. They were hunting. Riva and Hallam followed at a distance, invisible observers in a world of ghosts. The hunting party tracked a wounded mammoth for 3 hours. When they finally closed in, their attack was brutally efficient. 2 Neanderthals distracted the animal from the front, while 3 others circled behind. The remaining 2 positioned themselves for the killing blow. It was over in minutes. The mammoth fell. The Neanderthals began processing the kill immediately. No celebration. No words. Just efficient work. Remarkable, Hallam said. They hunt like soldiers. Perfect coordination without any apparent communication. They do not need words, Riva observed. They know each other completely. Every movement, Every signal. They have hunted together their entire lives. The Neanderthals worked through the afternoon, cutting meat, preserving what they could, eating their fill. As darkness approached, they carried their harvest back toward their cave. They passed no one, spoke to no one, needed no one beyond their small family group. Now, Rivas said, let us observe the humans. The simulation shifted. Same time period, same region. But now they watched a different species that a human band was traveling through a river valley. Perhaps 40 individuals. Men, women, children, elders. They moved more slowly than the Neanderthals. More noise. Children laughing. Adults talking. It seemed chaotic compared to the silent efficiency they had just witnessed. They are vulnerable, Hallam noted. So much noise. Any predator would hear them coming. Watch what happens next. A scout ran back from ahead. He was pointing and speaking rapidly. Riva activated the translation function on her display. Another group ahead. Maybe 20 people. Coming this direction. The human stopped. Riva expected tension. Weapons readied. Defensive positions. Instead, the leader of the band smiled. Good. We have extra furs from the last hunt. Maybe they have salt. The two groups met an hour later. There was no fighting. No posturing. Instead, there was greeting, touch, laughter. The leaders sat together and talked while others began examining each other's goods. Hallam watched with obvious confusion. They're giving away resources, furs they could use themselves. This makes no evolutionary sense. Continue watching. The trading took several hours. Furs were exchanged for salt. Tools were exchanged for dried fish. But the most important exchange was not physical, that a young woman from one group spent time with a young man from the other. By evening, they were sitting together as shared fire. By the next morning, she had joined his band. A permanent connection formed between two groups that had been strangers the day before. They are building networks, Riva said. Every trade creates a relationship. Every marriage creates an alliance. That young woman will remember her birth family. Her children will have relatives in two different bands. Those bands will help each other in times of need. Hallam was beginning to understand. They are investing in relationships, sacrificing short-term resources for long-term connections. Exactly. The simulation advanced 3 months. Winter had arrived. The same harsh conditions that challenged the Neanderthals. One of the human bands was struggling. Disease had killed several hunters. Food was scarce, but they did not face it alone that a runner was sent to allied groups. Within weeks, help arrived. Food, medicine, additional hunters to help feed the sick. The band that was struggling received support from 3 different groups, all connected through previous trades and marriages. They survived, Hallam said quietly, not because they were stronger, but because they had friends. Friends they made from strangers. Riva pulled up comparative data. During the same winter, the simulation shows 2 Neanderthal groups going extinct. They had no one to call for help, no network to rely on. They died alone. Hallam sat down on a simulated rock, forgetting for a moment that he was in a holographic world. The humans weaponized cooperation. They turned social bonds into survival advantages. Riva nodded. They could look at a stranger and think friend instead of threat. That single mental shift changed everything. Every person they met was a potential ally. Every interaction was an opportunity to build their network. And the Neanderthals could not do this. They were too isolated, too self-sufficient, too proud. Riva watched the humans in the simulation, gathered around their fires, sharing stories and food with people they had not known a day ago. The Neanderthals did not lose a war. They lost a competition they never even knew they were playing. Hallam stood and faced her. How long did this take? How long until the Neanderthals were gone? About 5,000 years of coexistence. Then nothing. And the humans never even noticed they were winning. Riva shook her head. They were just being human, making friends, building connections, absorbing anyone who would join them. She paused, including the Neanderthals themselves. The simulation ended. They stood in the empty chamber, surrounded by darkness. I need to see the final centuries, Hallam said. I need to understand exactly how it ended. Riva agreed. The answer was close now, and it was more disturbing than she had imagined. The timeline glowed red at 40,000 years ago and faded to black at 35,000. Riva stood before the massive display, watching 5,000 years of history compressed into a single image. This was the overlap period, the final centuries of coexistence between humans and Neanderthals, the end of one species and the triumph of another. Hallam joined her, carrying data tablets in all four hands. I have reviewed every archaeological site from this period, every burial, every settlement, every scrap of evidence we have. And no genocide. Hallam placed the tablets on the console. No war, no mass graves, no evidence of organized violence between the species. He sounded almost disappointed. Whatever happened, it was not conquest. Riva had expected this. War would have been simpler to understand. War had clear winners and losers, clear villains and victims. But evolution rarely worked that way. Show me the population data, she said. Hallam pulled up the graphs. 2 lines, one blue for Neanderthals, one red for humans. At the start of the overlap period, the lines were relatively close. Perhaps 100,000 Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia. Perhaps 200,000 humans in overlapping territories. Then the lines began to separate. The human population grew steadily. More children surviving to adulthood. More groups forming. More territory occupied. By the middle of the overlap period, humans outnumbered Neanderthals 3-1. The Neanderthal line stayed flat, then began to decline. Their birth rates were lower, Hallam explained. Longer gaps between children. Higher infant mortality. Smaller group sizes meant fewer potential mates. The mathematics were against them from the start. Riva traced the lines with her finger. But look here. The decline accelerates after 38,000 years ago. Something changed. Hallam nodded. That is when the interbreeding became significant. He pulled up genetic data. DNA analysis of remains from this period showed increasing levels of human genetics in Neanderthal populations and Neanderthal genetics in human populations. They were mixing, Riva said. Yes, Neanderthals were joining human groups. Human groups were accepting them. Marriages, alliances, integration. Hallam highlighted specific data points. A Neanderthal who joined a human band would have access to larger social networks, better food security, more potential mates. It was a logical choice, but it diluted their population. Precisely. Hallam pulled up a mathematical model. I ran the simulations. Even with zero conflict between the species, population dynamics alone guaranteed Neanderthal extinction. Their numbers were too small. Human numbers were too large. Every generation, more Neanderthals integrated into human groups. Every generation, fewer pure Neanderthals remained. Riva studied the model. The mathematics were clear, inevitable, cruel in their simplicity. They did not die, she said slowly. They were absorbed. Yes. Hallam sat down heavily. The humans accepted them, welcomed them, interbred with them, and in doing so, erased them as a separate species. Riva thought about what this meant. The Neanderthals had not been conquered. They had not been killed. They had been loved into extinction, welcomed into human groups until there was nothing left that was purely Neanderthal. It was the kindness that killed them, she said. Hallam looked up sharply. That is a dark way to phrase it, but accurate. Riva pulled up images of Neanderthal-human hybrid children from the archaeological record. The humans did not see Neanderthals as enemies. They saw them as potential family members, potential allies, potential mates. And the Neanderthals who accepted that offer survived. Their genes survived, but their species did not. She walked along the display, watching the final centuries unfold. The blue line dropping, the red line rising. 2 species becoming one. The last pure Neanderthals would have lived in isolated groups, she said. Remote areas, mountains, islands, places where human networks had not yet reached. They held out for a few thousand years, Hallam confirmed. But eventually, the networks caught up with them. And wherever humans went, they offered the same thing. Join us. Trade with us. Marry us. Become part of our family. An offer the Neanderthals had no defense against. How do you defend against friendship? Hallam asked bitterly. Against acceptance? Against love? Riva did not answer. She was thinking about the galaxy, about the hundreds of species that had encountered humanity since they achieved spaceflight, about the trade agreements, the cultural exchanges, the marriages between humans and other species that were becoming increasingly common. Hallam, she said quietly. What if they are doing it again? Hallam froze. Think about it, Riva continued. Human cultural products have spread to dozens of species. Human languages are taught on alien worlds. Human genes are mixing with other species through medical technology and compatible reproduction. That is different, Hallam said. We are not Neanderthals. We have technology. We have awareness. We know what they are capable of. Did it help the Neanderthals who joined human groups? They were aware too. They chose to join. They chose integration over isolation. Riva turned to face him. And now their genes exist only inside human bodies. Hallam was silent for a long moment. If this is what they did to their closest relatives, he finally said, a species they respected enough to interbreed with, a species they welcomed into their families, what would they do to us? Riva saved the data and prepared her preliminary report. The Galactic Consortium needed to see this. They needed to understand what kind of species was knocking at their door. Not conquerors, something far more dangerous, survivors. 12 faces stared at Riva from the holographic council chamber. 12 species. 12 sets of eyes filled with varying degrees of confusion, interest, and growing concern. Counselor Veth of the Kasori spoke first. You called an emergency session to discuss ancient Earth history? Dr. San, I hope you understand how unusual this is. Riva stood at the presentation platform, her silver skin reflecting the blue glow of the displays around her. Hallam waited behind her, tablets ready with supporting data. I called this session because what we discovered has direct implication for the Galactic Union, Riva said. Humanity is requesting full membership. Before we grant it, you need to understand what they are. We know what they are, said Counselor Marine of the Telethai. Young species, aggressive, expansionist. Typical pattern for newly spacefaring civilizations. No, Riva shook her head. They are not typical, and they are not what you think. She activated her presentation. The data filled the chamber. Neanderthal skulls, human skulls, genetic comparisons, population graphs, archaeological evidence. For 20 minutes, she explained everything. The physical superiority of Neanderthals, the social superiority of humans, the slow absorption that erased an entire species without a single war being fought. When she finished, silence filled the chamber. Counselor Veth leaned forward. This is interesting history, but it happened 40,000 years ago. What relevance does it have today? All the relevance in the galaxy. Riva pulled up new data, current data. Look at what humanity has done since achieving spaceflight. The display showed a map of known space. Human presence was marked in red. Trade routes, cultural exchanges, diplomatic relationships. The red spread across the map like blood vessels, connecting dozens of species. Every species that has made extended contact with humanity has signed trade agreements within 10 years, Riva said. Every single one. Trade is normal. Counselor Marine objected. We all trade. Human cultural products are now consumed by 47 different species. Riva highlighted the data. Their music, their stories, their art, their entertainment, spreading faster than any cultural export in galactic history. They are creative. This is not threatening. Human languages are taught in schools on 12 non-human worlds. Riva pulled up more data, not because it is required, because species want to learn. They want to communicate directly with humans. They want to understand human thinking. The council was growing quieter. 3 species have formally requested human mediators for their internal conflicts, Riva continued. Species that have been fighting each other for centuries have asked humans to help them make peace. Because humans are neutral, Counselor Veth said. Outside parties often make good mediators. Or because humans are extremely good at making different groups work together. Riva let that statement hang in the air. The same skill that let them absorb the Neanderthals. Hallam stepped forward. There is more. We have analyzed genetic data from mixed species communities, communities where humans live alongside other species. You pulled up the data. Interspecies relationships involving humans have increased 400% in the last 50 years. Medical technology now allows genetic compatibility between humans and 17 different species. What are you suggesting? Counselor Marine demanded. That humans are trying to breed us out of existence. No. Riva's voice was calm. I am suggesting they do not have to try. It is simply what they do. They connect. They trade. They share. They love. And slowly, gradually, inevitably, they become essential. She pulled up population projections. At current rates of cultural and genetic exchange, human influence will be measurable in the genome of every major spacefaring species within 50 generations. The council chamber erupted. This is speculation. Fear-mongering. We are not primitive cave dwellers. Riva waited for the noise to die down. Then she spoke again. The Neanderthals were not primitive either. They were intelligent, capable, physically superior. They had every advantage except one. They could not match the human ability to turn strangers into family. She looked at each counselor in turn. Can you? Counselor Veth raised a hand for silence. Dr. San, are you recommending we deny humanity membership in the Union? Riva hesitated. This was the question she had been dreading. No, she finally said. I am recommending we understand what we are dealing with. Humanity does not conquer through war. They conquer through friendship. They make themselves useful. They make themselves loved. And by the time you realize what is happening, your grandchildren are half human. Then what do you suggest? Riva looked at Hallam. He nodded slightly. I suggest we accept them, Riva said. Because the alternative is isolation. And isolation is exactly what killed the Neanderthals. The council was silent. You cannot fight connection with separation, Riva continued. You can only decide what kind of connection you want. The Neanderthals who joined human groups survived. Their genes are still here, inside every human alive today. The ones who stayed isolated are gone completely. Counselor Marine spoke slowly. You are saying we should embrace them, even knowing what they are. I am saying we do not have a choice. They will connect with us whether we want them to or not. The only question is whether we participate willingly or get left behind. Riva saved her presentation. The council would debate for days, maybe weeks, but she already knew the outcome. Humanity would be accepted, because the alternative was unthinkable. And somewhere, deep in her mind, a small voice wondered if that was exactly what the humans were counting on. Earth turned slowly beneath them, a blue and white marble floating in the darkness of space. Riva and Hallam sat in the observation deck of Research Station Palax 7, watching the planet that had produced the most remarkable species the galaxy had ever encountered. Their report was finished, transmitted to the consortium. Now they waited. I keep thinking about the last Neanderthals, Hallam said quietly. His 4 arms were folded across his chest. The final few hundred, living in isolated caves while the world changed around them. Riva did not respond immediately. She was watching the lights on Earth's night side. Cities, billions of humans, connected to each other through invisible networks of communication and commerce. Connected to each other in ways the Neanderthals never could have imagined. Do you think they knew? Hallam continued. At the end? Do you think they understood what was happening? I doubt it. Riva's voice was soft. From their perspective, nothing dramatic was occurring. Humans appeared, traded with them, sometimes married into their groups. Their children had more opportunities with human bands than with isolated Neanderthal families. It must have seemed natural, inevitable, death by 1,000 kindnesses, survival through 1,000 connections. Riva turned to face him. That is the other way to see it. The Neanderthals who joined human groups did survive. Their genes are still present in every human alive today. In a sense, they won. Hallam considered this. But they stopped being Neanderthals. They became something new, part of a larger whole. Riva looked back at Earth. Perhaps that is not death. Perhaps it is evolution. They sat in silence for a while. The station's systems hummed quietly around them. Earth continued its slow rotation below. The Council will accept humanity, Hallam said eventually. You know they will. Yes. And then what happens to us? Riva had been thinking about this question for days. The answer frightened her, but also gave her hope. We change, she said. We connect with them. We trade with them. We learn from them. We share with them. And over time, we become something new. Like the Neanderthals. Like everyone who encounters humans. Riva smiled slightly. They do not assimilate others through force. They assimilate others through value. They make themselves so useful, so essential, so beloved, that separation becomes unthinkable. Hallam unfolded his arms and placed 2 hands on the observation window. I've been trying to determine if this makes them dangerous, and I cannot decide. He pressed his palms against the glass. They are not predators. They do not consume other species. They are not parasites. They do not harm their hosts. They are something else entirely. Riva remembered a word from old Velothi texts, a concept that had seemed abstract until now. Symbionts. Hallam turned to look at her. Creatures that survive by making themselves essential to others, Riva explained. By forming bonds so deep that both parties benefit. By creating relationships where separation hurts everyone. Is that what humans are? I think so. Riva stood and walked to the window. The Neanderthals were perfect survival machines. Built for harsh conditions. Built for independence. Built for isolation. And they failed because they could not adapt to a world where connection mattered more than strength. She watched a human satellite pass by in the distance, carrying communications between Earth and the stars. Humans evolved the opposite way. They built their survival around others, around cooperation, around the ability to turn any stranger into family. They're not the strongest species in the galaxy. They're not the smartest. They're not the most advanced. But they're the best at making friends. Hallam joined her at the window. And friendship is their weapon. Friendship is their armor. Their shield. Their bridge across every gap. Riva placed her silver hand against the glass. They asked why only one survived. The answer is simple. The Neanderthals lived in families. Humans lived in the entire world. The final report would be submitted to the Consortium Council within the hour. Riva already knew what it would say. Humanity should be admitted to the Galactic Union. Not because they were safe. Not because they were harmless. But because they were necessary. The galaxy was full of isolated species. Suspicious of each other. Armed against each other. Waiting for wars that might never come. Humanity could be the bridge that connected them all. The social glue that held civilization together. Or they could be the force that slowly, gently, lovingly absorbed every other species into themselves. Perhaps both were true. I have one more observation for the record, Hallam said. What? I like them. He sounded almost embarrassed to admit it. I have studied them for weeks, analyzed their history, documented their behavior. And despite everything I know, I find myself wanting to know more, wanting to meet them, wanting to be their friend. Riva nodded slowly. I feel the same. Is that their influence? Or is it genuine? Does it matter? Riva transmitted the final report. That is how they work. They make you want to be connected. And by the time you realize it, you already are. Earth turned below them, blue and white and beautiful. Home to a species that had survived not through strength, but through love, through connection, through an endless, unstoppable drive to turn strangers into family. The Neanderthals had been magnificent, perfect, alone. The humans were fragile, flawed, together, and together they had conquered a world. Soon, they would conquer the stars, not with weapons, not with war, with friendship,